It begins with silence. A vault door, thick with 3 decades of dust, is finally forced open. The metal groans, as if protesting the intrusion, and the air that seeps out is heavy, stale, carrying with it the weight of Time itself. For 30 years, no one had dared to touch what lay inside, not because they had forgotten, but because the name attached to that vault, Sammy Davis Jr., was too legendary, too sacred, and too complicated. Sammy Davis Jr. was not just an entertainer. He was a force of nature, a singer, dancer, actor, comedian, and the only black member of the Rat Pack in the 1,960 seconds, standing shoulder to shoulder with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. He lived larger than life, but he also died with debts, lawsuits, and unanswered questions. His vault was rumored to contain the secrets he never wanted the world to see: private letters, unreleased recordings, even whispers of hidden contracts and debts tied to the mob. So, when the key finally turned, when the steel lock finally gave way, the small group gathered there, froze in place. Because in that moment, it wasn't just about opening a storage room. It was about tearing open the final chapter of Sammy's story, one that had been sealed shut since his death in 1990. The press had long speculated. Biographers had written pages upon pages, trying to decode the contradictions of his life, the wealth that vanished, the friendships that soured, the controversies that never fully faded. But the vault was the one place that might still hold answers. Imagine standing there, in the dim light, the echoes of Sammy's voice still lingering in the cultural memory, his defiance, his laughter, his pain. Then I imagine realizing that you're about to step into a room that hasn't been touched since his funeral. His family fought for decades over his estate. Creditors chased the remnants of his fortune. And yet here, behind this steel barrier, was the untouched, unspoken truth. When the door swung open, the world outside seemed to fall away. What they saw inside would not only freeze them in their tracks, but force everyone to rethink the man they thought they knew. Sammy Davis Jr., the smiling, glittering star of the Rat Pack, had left behind more than memories. He had left behind mysteries. And as the first box was lifted out of the shadows, a chill ran through the room. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes, it waits silent, patient, until the moment someone dares to open the vault. The vault may have been sealed for 30 years, but Sammy Davis Jr. The story began in the most unlikely of places, backstage in the crumbling theaters of Harlem during the 1,920 seconds. He was born in Harlem, New York, in 1925, the son of entertainers who lived more on the road than in a home. His father, Sammy Davis Sr., was a dancer. His mother, Elvira Sanchez, a Puerto Rican dancer of Afro-Cuban descent, glided across stages but slipped away from her son's life early. She left when Sammy was only 3 years old, leaving Chaim in the care of his father and his father's dance partner, Will Maston. That small trio, Sammy Sr., Will Maston, and the boy would become his family and, eventually, his act. The Will Maston trio became a touring unit, and Sammy Jr. was thrust into the spotlight before he could even spell his own name. At the age of 3, he was already shuffling across stage floors, soaking in applause like oxygen. He would later say that he never had a childhood. "I never went to school," he once admitted. "The stage was my school. The audience, my teachers. See, but this kind of education came at a brutal cost. The America Sammy grew up in was raw with racism. As a little boy, touring with 2 black men, he experienced humiliation that would burn into his soul. White hotels wouldn't allow him inside. Restaurants turned Hyam away, while his father and Will Maston tried to shield Hyam. The boy absorbed every slight every insult. "You can't tell a kid, there's no prejudice," Sammy once reflected. He knows by the way they look at Hyam. In its tenor, on the road, though, Sammy discovered something else: survival through talent. He was a sponge for imitation, copying accents, mastering dance styles, learning to play instruments, and shaping his voice into whatever sound the audience wanted. Tap dancing became his weapon, comedy became his shield, and music was his salvation. But behind the glitter of applause was a boy aching for belonging. Sammy craved acceptance not just from audiences, but from a society that insisted he was an outsider. He was too black for white America, too eccentric for the rigid expectations of the black community, and later, too Jewish for both. That feeling of not fitting in became the undercurrent of his entire life, driving him to overachieve, to outshine, to prove he himself again and again. One of the most defining chapters of his childhood came during World War II. Drafted into the army at just 18, Sammy thought he was going to serve his country. Instead, he walked into a nightmare. The army was deeply segregated, and Sammy was assigned to an all-black unit, where he became the target of vicious racism from white soldiers. They beat Hyam. They urinated in his food. They once painted "Coon" across his forehead in chalk. But the cruelty did not break him. Instead, Sammy discovered resilience in the most unexpected way. By performing, he would sing, dance, and make the same men who tormented him laugh. Slowly, his ability to entertain wore down the walls of hatred, if only for a moment. He later said, "My talent was the weapon, the power, the way for me to fight." And that phrase, "my talent was the weapon," would define his life. Sammy Davis Jr. learned that the world might spit on him, but the stage gave him the ability to demand respect, even if only under the lights. When the war ended, Sammy returned to the only family he had ever known, the Will Maston Trio. The three men toured endlessly, driving through the Jim Crow South, where Sammy often had to sleep in the car because hotels were segregated. He was still a young man, still finding his voice, but his reputation began to grow. People whispered about the kid who could do everything. He wasn't just a dancer. He could sing like a crooner, crack jokes like a comic, and mimic anyone from Humphrey Bogart to James Cagney. He was a one-man orchestra of entertainment. In the smoky back rooms of clubs, he started to attract attention. Audiences gasped when he switched from a jazz ballad into a dead-on eye impression of Frank Sinatra, then exploded into thunderous tap rhythms that left the stage shaking. The boy from Harlem was turning into something unstoppable. But childhood scars never fade completely. For Sammy, the hunger to belong, to be seen not as a black entertainer, but simply as a man, was a wound that fame would never fully heal. Even as he rose from those dingy nightclubs to the neon of Las Vegas, the echoes of rejection and ridicule haunted him. Years later, when asked how his childhood shaped him, Sammy didn't hesitate. He said, "I had to learn to live with rejection before I could ever live with success." His now. It's easy to romanticize his early years, the tap shoes too big for his feet, is the way audiences marveled at a child prodigy. But the truth is darker. Sammy Davis Jr. His origins were forged in pain, prejudice, and the relentless pressure to perform. He didn't just want to be good. He had to be perfect, because for Sammy, perfection meant survival. And as the vault would later remind everyone, the weight of that survival carried secrets too heavy to be buried forever. By the team, the young Sammy Davis Jr. was in his 20s. The world was beginning to take notice. But no one, Not even his closest friends could I imagine just how far he would climb, or how devastating the price of that climb would be. Because the child who never had a home was about to become a man who belonged to the world, but belonged to no one. By the late 1940s, Sammy Davis Jr. had outgrown the small-town theaters and smoky bars where the Unmasked trio eked out a living. The trio's act was polished, charming, and sharp, but it was Sammy restless, dazzling, uncontainable, who lit up the stage. Everywhere they went, word spread about the kid who could do it all. He wasn't just a dancer, not just a singer, not just a comedian. He was a spectacle. He could tap dance with the speed of fire, croon a ballad with heartbreaking tenderness, then spin around and impersonate the voices of Hollywood's most famous stars. Audiences left clubs whispering that they had seen something historic. But for years, show business still treated Haim as an opening act, a novelty, a sideshow. That all changed in 1947, when the trio performed at Ciro's, a glamorous Hollywood nightclub. The audience that night included Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, two of the biggest names in the industry. Sammy's performance stopped them cold. Bogart reportedly leaned forward, cigarette dangling from his lips, and whispered, "That kid's got it." Within weeks, doors that had always been shut to a black entertainer began to creak open. The true breakthrough, however, came in 1951. The Unmasked trio was booked at Ciro's again, this T.E. as the headlining act. On opening night, the crowd was filled with Hollywood elite. But one man in particular changed Sammy's life. Frank Sinatra. The chairman of the board sat there, arms folded, skeptical at first. But when Sammy launched into a flawless impersonation of Sinatra he himself, complete with the singer's cocky grin and swinging phrasing, the audience erupted. Sinatra roared with laughter. By the end of the night, and he wasn't just impressed, he was converted. That night sparked a friendship and mentorship that would define Sammy's career. Sinatra saw in Sammy something beyond talent, resilience, hunger, and the charisma to bridge worlds. In a T.M., when segregation was still law in much of America, Sinatra, who despised racism, extended his hand and his protection. "You're one of us now," he told Sammy. And just like that, Sammy Davis Jr. found he himself welcomed into the most exclusive circle in show business, the Rat Pack. The Rat Pack Sinatra, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. And now Sammy wasn't just a group of entertainers. They were a cultural force, redefining masculinity, glamour, and rebellion in the post-war era. Their playground was Las Vegas, a desert oasis exploding with neon and decadence. Every night, the pack would perform at the Sands Hotel. Their shows, a mixture of music, comedy, improvisation, and inside jokes. And every night, Sammy Davis Jr. stole the spotlight. On stage, he was electric. He could trade barbs with Dean Martin, riff off Sinatra's swagger, then silence the room with a ballad that seemed to bleed from his soul. Critics called Haim the greatest living entertainer. But backstage, Sammy was still navigating a cruel contradiction. Las Vegas, in the 1,950 seconds, was a city of illusions. And while white audiences cheered Sammy's performances, the hotels often refused to let him stay as a guest. After dazzling crowds at the Sands, he was forced to lodge in the west side of town, in run-down motels reserved for black performers. There were nights when Sammy would be headlining to standing ovations, only to walk outside and be denied entry into the casino's restaurants. Sinatra fought back, threatening to pull his own performances unless the hotels lifted their bans, and slowly, painfully, things began to change. But the scars of humiliation never left Sammy. His rise wasn't just about fame, it was about defiance. He wasn't supposed to be there, on the same stage as white stars, drinking from the same glasses, commanding the same spotlight. Every night he stepped on stage was a revolution in motion. But fame brought new temptations, too. Hollywood adored Haim. Directors began casting him in films. In 1956, his role in Mr. Wonderful introduced Haim to mainstream audiences beyond the nightclubs. His recording career exploded, with songs like Something's Gotta Give and Love Me or Leave Me climbing the charts. And yet, behind every cheer, Sammy felt the pressure to be perfect, to entertain, to belong. One of the most defining and dangerous turning points came in 1954. At just 29 years old, Sammy was driving from Las Vegas to Los Angeles after a late-night performance. Exhausted, he crashed his car into another vehicle. The accident was catastrophic. Sammy's face was shattered. More devastatingly, he lost his left eye. For weeks, his future as a performer seemed finished. But Sammy refused to surrender. With a glass eye and a patch covering his wound, he returned to the stage just 2 months later. The audience that night expected fragility, but what they saw was fire. Sammy sang with a rawness, a vulnerability that transcended entertainment. He had almost died, but he was not broken. In fact, he seemed more alive than ever. The accident also marked a profound spiritual transformation. While recovering, Sammy had long conversations with friends in Hollywood who were Jewish, drawn to the resilience of a people who had survived centuries of persecution. Sammy converted to Judaism. For him, it wasn't just faith, it was identity. He famously said, "I'm a one-eyed Negro Jew." It was both a badge of pride and a burden. That phrase summed up the paradox of his existence. Marginalized 3 times over, yet defiant, unshakable, larger than life. By the late 1950s, Sammy Davis Jr. was no longer the boy from Harlem. He was a superstar. He was singing at the White House, sharing the stage with Sinatra, recording hit after hit. But with success came controversy. His relationships, particularly his high-profile romance with actress Kim Novak, scandalized both Hollywood studios and racist tabloids. Interracial love was taboo, and studio executives threatened to ruin Haim if he didn't end it. Sammy was forced into secrecy, his personal life suffocated by prejudice. Still, nothing could stop his momentum. On stage, he was a whirlwind. In film, he was a trailblazer. And, with the Rat Pack, he became part of a cultural juggernaut that defined an era. But success came with a price. The deeper Sammy embedded himself in the world of the Rat Pack, the closer he brushed against the dangerous underworld of mobsters who ran Las Vegas. Deals were struck behind closed doors. Debts were whispered about in shadowy corners. And while Sammy danced under the bright lights, darker forces were circling. The boy who once danced for nickels on street corners was now drinking champagne with presidents and gangsters. He had climbed the mountain, but storms were gathering at the summit. And decades later, when the vault was opened, those storms would echo through the items left behind the letters. The contracts, the secrets that proved success, was never as golden as it seemed. Sammy Davis Jr. had risen from obscurity to become one of the most famous entertainers in the world. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall became. By the early 1960s, Sammy Davis Jr. He had become more than a performer. He was a cultural phenomenon. The boy who once tap-danced in the shadows of Harlem theaters now stood in the blazing spotlight of the world stage. His face appeared on magazine covers. His songs topped the charts. His films sold out theaters. And on the stages of Las Vegas, he was not just an entertainer, but an event, an experience people crossed state lines to witness. At the Sands Hotel, where the Rat Pack reigned supreme, Sammy was often described as the heart of the group. Frank Sinatra was the leader, Dean Martin the charmer, but Sammy was the showstopper, the one whose sheer energy could lift an entire room into ecstasy. Night after night, he unleashed everything. Lightning tap routines that blurred into a frenzy, soulful ballads that made even the toughest men wipe their eyes, and comedy so sharp it cut through racial and social tensions like a blade. The world had never seen anyone like Chaim. He was, as one critic wrote, a kaleidoscope of talent, dazzling and dizzying, impossible to define. To Black America, he was a pioneer, proof that a man of color could stand shoulder to shoulder with white icons. To white America, he was a paradox, adored on stage, still discriminated against off it. Yet Sammy didn't flinch. He refused to be confined to the margins. He wanted the world, and for a time, he had it. His influence reached far beyond entertainment. Sammy became a visible figure in politics and civil rights, albeit in ways that often divided opinion. He marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also stood by Richard Nixon, famously hugging the president on national television. That image, Sammy, the black entertainer who had fought against racism his whole life. Embracing Nixon outraged many in the black community. But to Sammy, politics was personal. He had spent his entire life navigating between worlds, crossing boundaries that others insisted should remain closed. To Chaim, shaking Nixon's hand was not betrayal, it was survival. "I had to make peace with everyone," he once said, "because everyone had power over me." At the same time, Sammy's personal life became the stuff of tabloids. His marriages, particularly to Swedish actress May Britt, were lightning rods of controversy. Their union in 1960, an interracial marriage at a time, when many states still outlawed, it sparked a media firestorm. Sammy faced threats from white supremacists, condemnation from Hollywood executives, and backlash, even from some in the black community. But he defied them all. For a moment, his life seemed like the embodiment of the American dream, a star who had conquered prejudice with talent, charisma, and love. On stage, his hits defined an era. Songs like "I've Gotta Be Me" became anthems, reflecting not just his artistry, but his philosophy. The lyrics were his creed. He had spent his life trying to fit in, but ultimately, he realized he could only survive by being authentically he himself, no matter the cost. Film roles further cemented his status. He starred in movies like Ocean's 11, alongside Sinatra and Martin, blending seamlessly into Hollywood's golden circle. He brought energy and charm to Robin and the Seven Hoods, Sweet Charity, and countless variety shows on television. He was everywhere, dazzling everyone. And yet, even at the peak, shadows lingered. Sammy was notorious for working he himself to exhaustion, performing 3 shows a night, flying across the country at dawn, recording albums during the day. He lived for the applause, but the silence afterward gnawed at him. Those who knew him best spoke of his loneliness. He could make thousands laugh, but he often spent nights alone, haunted by doubts. Was he truly loved, or merely tolerated for his talent? The demands of fame pushed him deeper into dangerous habits. Sammy developed a taste for extravagance, expensive cars, lavish parties, jewelry that sparkled as brightly as the lights on the Vegas Strip. His spending was legendary. But behind the glamour lay a darker truth: mounting debts, reckless investments, and a financial spiral that would eventually consume him. He also wrestled with addictions, cigarettes, alcohol, and later, heavy drug use began to chip away at the vitality that had once seemed boundless. Friends begged Chaim to slow down, but Sammy could not. "If I stop," he said, "I'll disappear. Is I last in the looks today." By the late 1960s, America itself was changing. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, assassinations, protests. The country was in turmoil. Sammy, once the symbol of progress, suddenly seemed caught between eras. To younger activists, he was too cozy with white power, too eager to please the establishment. To conservative America, he was still an outsider. His embrace of Judaism, his interracial marriage, his politics, everything about Chaim defied easy labels. Still, he pressed on, reinventing himself again and again. In the 1970 seconds, he recorded new hits, appeared on television specials, and dazzled Broadway audiences with his one-man show, Sammy Davis Jr., at the Coconut Grove. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, a reminder that, no matter his age or his demons, Sammy remained unmatched as an entertainer. But cracks were showing. His once velvet voice began to strain. His dancing, though still explosive, carried hints of weariness. Behind the scenes, creditors were circling, and old friends noticed a desperation in his eyes. He was a man at the top of the mountain, but the ground beneath him was shifting. One night in Las Vegas, after yet another triumphant show, Sinatra pulled Sammy aside. "You're burning yourself out," he warned. Sammy just smiled, lit another cigarette, and said, "I'd rather burn out in the light than fade away in the dark." He wasn't ispedit vermijden. That was Sammy Davis Jr., at his peak, unstoppable, magnetic, tragic. A man who had everything, and yet carried wounds that no amount of applause could heal. And decades later, when the vault was opened, the truth of that era spilled out in fragments, old contracts that showed the grip of the mob, letters filled with fear and longing, bills that revealed how quickly fortune had vanished. The vault wasn't just a room filled with possessions, it was a mirror, reflecting the paradox of Sammy Davis Jr., the brightest star, and the loneliest man in the room. At his peak, Sammy Davis Jr. belonged to the world. But the question lingered, did he ever truly belong to he himself? By the mid-1970 seconds, Sammy Davis Jr. was no longer just an entertainer. He was an institution. He had broken barriers, performed for presidents, and stood on stages across the globe. But behind the glittering curtain, the man who had once seemed indestructible was unraveling. Fame had lifted him higher than most could dream, but it also left him vulnerable to excess, to manipulation, to his own relentless hunger for acceptance. The first and most obvious crack was money. For decades, Sammy had lived as if fortune would never run dry. He surrounded himself with extravagance, tailored suits, diamonds the size of marbles, Rolls-Royces, and a Beverly Hills mansion that looked more like a museum than a home. He gave freely, showering friends, hangers-on, and strangers with gifts, terrified of being perceived as ungrateful. But behind the generosity lay recklessness. Sammy rarely read contracts, signing deals that left him with only scraps of the profits he generated. He gambled heavily in Las Vegas, often losing in one night what others earned in a year. By the late 1970 seconds, the IRS came knocking. Tax debts piled into the millions. To stay afloat, Sammy worked himself to the bone, agreeing to grueling schedules, television appearances, night after night of shows, commercials, even cameos that seemed beneath his stature. He once joked bitterly, I'll tap dance on your lawn if the check clears. The humor masked desperation. Drugs and alcohol tightened their grip. Sammy had always lived fast cigarettes, whiskey, late nights. But as the pressures mounted, he turned increasingly to cocaine. Friends noticed the change, the manic energy, the exhaustion, the way his once razor-sharp timing sometimes slipped. Dean Martin, his Rat Pack brother, pulled him aside more than once, warning him to slow down, to get help. But Sammy shrugged it off. "If I stop," he said, "I'll vanish." Isn't upright. The scandals followed. His marriage to May Britt had long since ended, but his relationships afterward were often chaotic. Affairs spilled into tabloids. Rumors swirled about wild parties, strange rituals, and even connections to the occult. One particularly damaging rumor claimed he had dabbled in Satanism during a period of excess in the 1,970 seconds, a climb Sammy half-jokingly admitted in interviews, though he dismissed it as a phase born of boredom and rebellion. The damage, however, it was done. For a man who had once represented progress and elegance, the image of Chaim, wrapped in dark hedonistic circles, stained his reputation. Then there was race. Sammy had spent his entire life trying to belong to white audiences, to black audiences, to America itself. But no matter how high he climbed, the walls of prejudice never fully fell. His embrace of Nixon in 1972, an embrace broadcast on national television, was seen by many African Americans as betrayal. He had campaigned for civil rights, marched with King. But to them, hugging Nixon was crossing a line. Sammy defended he himself, saying he wanted to bridge worlds, to show unity. But the backlash hurt deeply. For the first time, he felt estranged, not only from white America, but from his own community. The toll was visible. By the early 1,980 seconds, Sammy was a man divided. On stage, he still sparkled, still drew crowds, still delivered performances that left audiences in awe. But off stage, he was drowning. His debts ballooned to more than $7 million. The IRS seized his assets, his beloved collections, cars, art, jewelry were auctioned off to strangers. The mansion in Beverly Hills, once a palace of lights and laughter, was emptied, its walls echoing with silence. Sammy Davis Jr., one of the most famous men in America, it was now fighting to keep the lights on. And yet, perhaps the cruelest blow of all was his health. Decades of cigarettes, 4 or 5 packs a day, finally caught up with him. In 1989, doctors delivered the devastating news: throat cancer. For a man whose voice was his life, it was a death sentence. He tried to fight it, undergoing radiation and experimental treatments. But the disease advanced mercilessly. Within months, his once powerful voice was reduced to a rasp, his singing career effectively over. Those final performances, though, remain etched in memory. Weakened, thin, yet still defiant, Sammy stood on stage one last time with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin during their reunion tour. His body was failing, but his spirit blazed. The audience wept, aware they were witnessing the twilight of a legend. Behind the scenes, the vault grew heavier. Contracts detailing crushing debts, letters filled with regret, recordings that hinted at unfinished dreams, all of it piled up, waiting for the day when someone would turn the key. His friends whispered that Sammy was haunted by what he would leave behind. "I just want people to remember the good," he said. But he knew his scandals and his debts. In his contradictions, those shadows would linger. On May 16, 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. died in his Beverly Hills home. surrounded by family and close friends. He was 64 years old. At his funeral, Frank Sinatra wept openly, calling him the greatest entertainer who ever lived. Gregory Hines tapped out a tearful tribute, dancing on the stage in his honor. The world mourned the loss of a man who had seemed larger than life, a man who had carried both brilliance and burdens in equal measure. And then came the vault, sealed after his death, left untouched for 30 years. It became the ultimate symbol of Sammy's paradox. What would it reveal? The genius or the broken man? The triumphs or the scandals? The truth, as always with Sammy Davis Jr., was all of it. His story is not just one of glory, but of fragility, of a man who fought the world with his talent but could never quite conquer he himself. When Sammy Davis Jr. died in May 1990, the spotlight dimmed, but the shadows he left behind grew darker. The man the world had called Mr. Show Business was gone, but what remained was a tangle of debts, lawsuits, and broken promises. For decades, he had dazzled audiences into believing he was untouchable. In death, the harsh truth emerged. Sammy Davis Jr. had been running on fumes, his empire crumbling long before his final blow. The most immediate consequence was financial. At the time of his death, Sammy owed more than $7 million to the IRS. His estate, once thought to be overflowing with wealth, it was nearly bankrupt. The Beverly Hills mansion, stripped of its glamour, was sold off. Cars, jewelry, memorabilia objects that had once symbolized his larger-than-life persona were auctioned to cover the debts. Even his famed glass eye, preserved in a case. It became part of the macabre mythology surrounding his estate. For his family, it was a devastating blow. His wife, Altovise Davis, was left not only grieving, but drowning in financial ruin. Creditors swarmed, demanding payment. Lawyers circled, fighting over what little remained. For years, court battles raged, tarnishing the glow of his name. Instead of celebrating his artistry, headlines obsessed over unpaid bills, missing assets, and the chaos of his estate. Yet beyond the legal wrangling, there was a deeper reckoning. What did Sammy Davis Jr. truly leave behind? For all his triumphs, his story was riddled with contradictions. He had fought racism on stage, yet often bent under the weight of prejudice off it. He had preached individuality, yet yearned constantly for acceptance. He had achieved wealth, yet died nearly penniless. He had lived for applause, yet confessed to loneliness in the quiet hours. In the years following his death, his reputation went through cycles of rediscovery and critique. To some, he remained the greatest entertainer who ever lived, a man whose raw talent, resilience, and versatility were unmatched. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a man who sacrificed everything for fame, only to be consumed by it. The vault, locked for 30 years, became the focal point of this legacy. Families, fans, and biographers speculated endlessly about its contents. Did it contain unreleased recordings that would reveal another side of his genius? Love letters that exposed his hidden vulnerabilities? Contracts that tied Chaim to the mob? The mystery only deepened the sense of Sammy as an enigma, a man impossible to fully understand. But even without the vault's secrets, his influence reverberated. Sammy Davis Jr. opened doors that others had never dared to touch. He was the first black man to break into the Rat Pack, to headline in Las Vegas alongside white stars, to marry a white actress in the glare of Hollywood's cameras. He paved the way for future generations of performers artists like Michael Jackson, Prince, and Beyoncé, who carried his torch of versatility, defiance, and sheer showmanship. At the same time, his struggles offered sobering lessons. His addiction to excess, whether in money, substances, or validation, became a warning for young entertainers chasing the same dream. His life showed how fame could exalt, but also devour, how applause could mask despair, and how survival in show business often came at a cost far greater than talent alone. In the cultural memory, Sammy became two men. One was the dazzling star, the tap-dancing prodigy, the velvet-voiced crooner, the comedian who made Sinatra laugh, the trailblazer who stood proudly in defiance of segregation. The other was the man of contradictions, drowning in debt, alienated from parts of his community, chasing acceptance he never truly found. Both were real. Both were Sammy. In the decades after his death, tributes poured in. Broadway revivals honored his one-man shows. Documentaries revisited his story, exposing the pain beneath the glitter. Younger performers cited Chaim as inspiration, marveling at his fearlessness. And, still, the mystery of his vault lingered, a metaphor for the secrets he carried, the burdens he hid, the truths he never spoke aloud. When the vault was finally opened after 30 years, those who witnessed it said, the silence in the room was unlike anything they had felt before. It wasn't just about the objects inside. It was about confronting the reality that even legends leave behind fragments, not answers. His vault was not filled with gold or fortune. It was filled with echoes, letters, photographs, contracts, personal mementos that told of triumphs and betrayals, laughter and heartbreak. The consequence of Sammy Davis Jr.'s life was not only the debts or scandals, but the profound realization that genius does not shield anyone from fragility. His legacy is not polished, not simple, not easy to summarize. It is complex, messy, contradictory, just like the man himself. Today, when people speak of Sammy Davis Jr., they speak of a legend who lived in the spotlight, but wrestled with shadows. They speak of a man who carried three identities: Black, Jewish, and disabled at a time when each one alone was enough to marginalize someone. They speak of resilience, brilliance, and tragedy intertwined. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Sammy Davis Jr. Not perfection, not untouchable glamour, but the raw, unfiltered humanity of a man who dared to be everything, even when it cost him everything. 30 years after his death, when the heavy vault door finally creaked open, what emerged was not treasure, but testimony. Letters browned with age, contracts inked with desperation, recordings never released, fragments of a life that glittered in public but cracked in private. Those who stood there that day described a chill, as though the air itself carried Sammy's restless spirit. It wasn't gold or diamonds that froze them. It was the truth. Even after 3 decades, Sammy Davis Jr. remained an enigma. The vault became a metaphor for everything he was. On one shelf lay photographs, smiling eye images with Sinatra, Dean Martin, presidents, movie stars. On another, receipts and bills, stark reminders of the fortune that slipped through his fingers. Love letters whispered of romances forbidden or forgotten, scribbled in haste but heavy with longing. And, tucked in between, were fragments of faith, Jewish prayer books, notes scribbled about identity, belonging, and the never-ending search for home. What froze the witnesses was not any single revelation, but the sum of them. They saw a man who had given everything to the world and received both worship and rejection in return. They saw proof of debts larger than anyone had realized, showing how even at his peak, Sammy was shackled to financial ruin. They saw glimpses of despair, of a man who questioned whether he had ever truly been loved or only applauded. The open vault posed more questions than it answered. Why had he kept certain letters but destroyed others? What unreleased recordings did he hide? And why did he never share them? Did he know? Perhaps. That mystery was part of his legacy, that people would still be speculating decades later, leaning in closer to hear echoes of a man who could never be fully understood. For historians, the vault added layers to his story, but no conclusion. For fans, it deepened the ache of loss. For his family, it stirred both pride and pain. Davis Davis, his widow, once said that Sammy never truly belonged to her, to his children, or to his friends. He belonged to the world, she admitted, with both sadness and awe. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy. The man who craved belonging above all else was forever shared, never fully owned, not even by he himself. The open vault also reignited the debate over Sammy's place in American culture. Was he a pioneer, bravely breaking barriers of race, religion, and identity? Absolutely. But was he also a man who compromised too often, who longed so deeply for acceptance from white America that he sometimes alienated his own community? The answer is both. Sammy Davis Jr. was a man of contradictions, a performer who embodied the paradox of progress, celebrated for his talent, punished for his defiance, is misunderstood for his choices. Even in death, Sammy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. He showed how America could adore a black man on stage while denying high basic dignity off it. He showed how fame could lift someone to unimaginable heights, yet leave them penniless and broken. He showed how the hunger to be loved can drive genius, but also destroy it. And still, his brilliance cannot be denied. Watch a clip of Chaim tap dancing, and you see lightning in human form. Listen to his voice wrap around a ballad, and you hear both velvet and pain. See Chaim laughing with Sinatra and Dean Martin, and you glimpse the joy that kept Chaim alive through prejudice and loss. For every shadow, there was light. For every secret, there was a song. Perhaps that is why the vault mattered so much. Not because of what it contained, but because it reminded the world that Sammy Davis Jr. was more than an entertainer. He was a man who struggled, failed, rose, fell, and kept dancing through it all. His story was not a fairy tale, but a mirror reflecting both the promise and the cruelty of the American dream. Even now, questions linger. What would Sammy think of today's world, where artists of color command stages without the same chains of segregation? Would he see he himself in their freedom, or would he still feel the sting of exclusion? Would he be proud of the progress, or haunted by how much he sacrificed to carve the path? The vault, once sealed, no longer hides those questions. It has released them into the air, leaving us to wrestle with them. Sammy Davis Jr.'s legacy is not neat, not simple, not tied with a bow. It is messy, complicated, and deeply human. And perhaps that is why it endures. In the end, the man who sang, "I've Gotta Be Me," did exactly that. He was high himself, brilliant, flawed, defiant, vulnerable. He lived with one eye, 3 identities, countless contradictions, and a spirit that refused to be caged. And when the vault was opened, the world froze, not because they discovered answers, but because they were reminded of the power of questions. Sammy Davis Jr. remains a legend, but more importantly, he remains a mystery. And maybe that is how he wanted it. After all, the greatest performers never give everything away. They leave you wanting more, leaning forward, waiting for the next number, the next story, the next secret. And so, decades later, the curtain has not closed. The vault has been opened, but the enigma of Sammy Davis Jr. still dances in the shadows, forever alive, forever unfinished.